is Rita Teal. My twin sister was the person who started this entire fiasco earlier. Contributors to the Ladies' Sewing Circle in Annisquam, 1882. Many a little makes a mickle. Did you know you had a motto? There you go. So what that is all about, mickle means a lot. It's a Scottish word. So that is your motto. Guess who this is?
Mrs. Mickle.
Mrs. Mickle came from the front here. This is Charlotte Lane. Now all of us think of all of those folks in the sewing circle from years ago as being old ladies, but they started out like young ladies, okay? And this was what she looked like. And her father, Oliver Lane, had taken a daguerreotype across to China, and an artist had painted her so that he could have a portrait that he could carry around. So, Charlotte Lane, circa 1850s. My talk is called Mystery and Herstory. Yay. And it's about Annisquam's 2 signature quilts. Now, there are 2 types of signature quilt. You've just made your own block for a signature quilt. But there are 2 types. The first one is when autographed blocks are created by friends and or relatives, and they copied the 1880s autograph album fad. And those blocks were then made into a quilt. And the quilt was presented to a bride, a special member of the community or members, or in memory of loved ones. And the signatures of church and family members were common. So that's the first type of signature quilt that you'll see. The second type were signed blocks that were made into a quilt for raising money. Missionary work, supporting troops during the war, any war, and increasing the church coffers. And how did they do that? Well, they auctioned off the quilt to the highest bidder, but it was actually more productive to pay for a name on a block, get subscriptions for a block at usually 10 cents a person. So this was the type of quilt that we're going to be talking about turn of century, because both of our signature quilts are around 1900. Now, I'm not sure, Suzanne may be able to tell me, when I photographed this in the church, it was in what was called the B room. And it's still there, because when all the reconstruction was being done, couldn't get at it. But this is the signature quilt that is well known to most if you've been up to that B room, and it was named after the sewing bee. Sewing bee, completely different group than the sewing circle, although they often had conjoint meetings. And these blocks are smallish, 7 3/4 inch blocks. They're all signed, and there are actually 3 on the back that the quilter could not fit into the main panel. And those never seem to get seen, which is a bit of a shame. Now this is the block of the other quilt in the village, and this is in the Historic Society. This is in the firehouse. It's 16 inches square, much bigger. And I'm showing you this particular example because you can see what happens to quilt blocks that are red or blue when they get exposed to light. So see the difference. Luckily, the church blocks did not suffer this fate, so we'll come to the history for that in a minute. Now, this quilt is huge. This is our dining room table, and we had to fold the quilt in half, so you're seeing just one half of it. And the reason we were doing that, there's a magnifying glass on the near side. It's 80 by 80 inches, and Betsy Horowitz and I were getting all the names written down that had been signed on those blocks. So that was why it was spread out like this. Currently, it's rolled up in tissue paper, and it's in the firehouse. This is the back of the quilt in the firehouse. It is certainly not elegant. It is old sacking, bits of shirts. So this was not a quilt that you would have made to put on a bed, probably, because it's so pieced in the backing. Do you recognize the block? Yeah, okay. So this is George W. Harvey, who signed his own block for the quilt that you saw before. And the question was, well, where did that pattern come from? And it's actually lost in time. It's been called all kinds of things. Old Italian design. It was called snowflake, which seems a bit of a stretch. The mountain peak, snow block, cross stitch, and Maud's album quilt, with the idea that you embroidered her name in the middle. So this is the block that has multiple names that is used in the firehouse quilt, in the church quilt. And this is what they look like when these blocks, when they're all put together, because they make a secondary pattern. You can see that, right? It looks like a lattice work. And you can also appreciate in this one that the Griffins have signed 2 blocks, maybe not from the back, but the other important part is that each signature is individual. These are all people who have signed their own blocks, just like you did today. Many are dated, 3 on the back, as I mentioned. There's 75 total blocks, and the signatures are unique, and some do come with ink blots, because remember, at this time, India ink was the method by which one signed fabric. In March 11th, 1897, Ashley Smith and Bertha Clark signed blocks with their own names. Ashley Smith just happened to be the minister at the church. Bertha Clark was his, at that time, presumed to be his fiancée, but I don't know that. I don't know when they got engaged. February 1898, getting my 9s and 8s mixed up here, February 1898 is the last date on the quilt. That doesn't mean it was the last block to have been done, because not all the blocks were dated. The marriages in Gloucester in 1898 included that of Ashley Smith and Bertha Clark. So they were married in 1898. That's an important landmark in terms of the date. And then there's a history. If you've been into the church, there's a little pamphlet or a stapled group of pages that explain what the history of their quilt is. And much of this is by hearsay. The finished squares for the quilt were found in the attic of the Reverend Ashley Smith's home in Bangor, Maine. It's a bit far from Annisquam. And then there's some more information that's a bit confusing. Minutes of the Circle, dated 1897, indicate a signature quilt was being put together. These were something special, and people would contribute 10 cents to sign a square to be included in the quilt. Money earned from the ultimate sale of this quilt was used for acts of benevolence. There's no distinction in terms of which quilt they're talking about in 1897. So it could be one or it could be the other. So keep that in mind when you're reading history that comes from a long time ago and is only in piecemeal. Some of it may not be quite right. The Sewing Circle on the April 4th, 1989 minutes was distinctly about the village church quilt. Louise Kenyon, everybody will know Louise Kenyon, brought quilt squares that members were to take home to sew together. Now I think that was a whole separate activity, just like I did with you earlier. It was suggested that the very old quilt squares that Gertrude Griffin has should be assembled, framed, and given to the Annisquam Historical. Not sure that happened. The meeting was adjourned at 2:10. A delightful tea was served by the hostesses, Mrs. Fran Egan, Mrs. Lynette French. Do you remember this?
I don't.
and others who aren't in the room right now. Now, this is now February the 7th, so it takes a while to get things going, all right? But in 1990, it says on the side, I don't know whether you can read this, but this is from the minute book. It says, "Don't read." So these are minutes that you're not supposed to read. Ginny Kimball to pursue the making of the 100-year-old quilt. Again, it was given to Reverend Ashley Smith's wife when they moved to Bangor, Maine. It was found several years later in an attic and sent to M. Harvey. Mystery. There's Harveys around here. Was it Martha? And Gertrude Griffin lived close to Martha Harvey, but we don't know who M. Harvey was. You can see how secretaries who take minutes are so terribly important. Ginny reported that Mary Golden is a famous quilter and is coming March 8th to see the quilt. And she's the person who was based in Cape Ann at that time who did finish the quilt, put the blocks together and finished it. Does anybody know Mary Golden? I've looked her up on the net, but I've never met her, and she was a quilter.
She taught the quilting class at Gloucester High School in Adult Ed that I took when I was first married.
Great. Okay, so she taught at Gloucester High School.
At the Adult Ed.
Adult Ed.
Evening classes and different things, and she taught. She was fabulous. She taught the quilting class.
Were you old at that time? I thought you were a student.
It's 1978.
I'm giving her a hard time. Now, the important thing here, though, go back to original sources. If you look here, this is the history of Belfast, not Bangor. And Reverend Ashley Auburn Smith, the present pastor, born at Auburn in 1871, began his labors here November 1st, 1898. He had previously been settled in Annisquam. So he left Annisquam and went to not Bangor. So what are we going to do about that? And then we find out in Bangor that his church, and this is very interesting, because the church which he led went up in flames. The church was the first of 7 in the Queen City to go up in flames, and I didn't realize that Bangor had such a fire. Destroyed all kinds of buildings. The parsonage where Smith lived and his 1,200-volume library were destroyed in the conflagration. The Bible survived and was returned to the church when it was rebuilt and dedicated on June the 2nd, 1913. Now, if everything had been destroyed, how could the quilt blocks not have been among that destruction, right? So the mystery, that's why I said this is a mystery. What on earth is going on? Now, when you go to Bangor, Maine in the census in 1940, he's living in a different house. He's living on Fountain Street, Bangor, Maine, which does have an attic, because I wanted to check and see if there was an attic there. And the blocks may have been found in this attic, but the timing was different. Now, were the blocks in Annisquam and then sent to the family because they had nothing left? And this was their memories of Annisquam? I don't know. So this is my theory. The quilt was begun as an engagement or a wedding quilt. Many names aren't typical. They're not typical Squam names, and there are 2 in particular, Uncle Bert and Aunt Bertha. They suggest familiarity. Each block with its signature is unique. The Sewing Circle as a sponsoring group is uncertain. It's probably more likely to have come from the church. The Sewing Bee did not exist until 1902, so we can't use that as a possibility. And was it unfinished because of the limited number of blocks? In other words, it was too limited for a bed, and wall hangings weren't yet invented. So were they just sitting on them for a while? And were the blocks, as I mentioned, in Annisquam for several years before being sent to Bangor? Was the fire a reason to send the memories home? Now, the blocks were given to the Sewing Circle around 1989. That's what the story is, by Roberta Smith. Now, the interesting thing is her husband's name was Robert, and he was the son of Bertha and Ashley, and all of them on the census lived in the same house. So they were in Bangor, presumably. We know where her house was. Roberta is the one who brought them to the Sewing Circle. So the other thing I wanted to show you with the AVC quilt is all of the blobby handwriting. I don't know whether you can see it from the back, but some of the handwriting is not very good. Whereas on the quilt from the firehouse, all of the handwriting is pretty standard. And I wanted to show you that on this quilt, we actually now have Bertha is now Smith. Ashley is also here as Smith. And the quilt was made, possibly not completely done by her, but finished possibly by Mrs. Judith Lane. And we know when she died from records, and she was 89 years old when she finished this quilt. So 301, this isn't 75, this is 301 of 600 signed white triangular sections, and they're almost all from one scribe, not multiple different people having signed it. Ashley Smith and Bertha Smith are there in blocks, which I showed you, and they were married in 1898. And we know that the quilt was finished in late 1901 or 1902 by the age of the person who signed it as having made it. So the theory for this one, during or after creating the wedding quilt blocks, if that's the true case for the village church quilt, plans for a larger quilt as a fundraiser might have taken hold, and Annisquam Village Church was likely the beneficiary. All of these institutions revolved around raising money for the church in the early days. And sponsors would donate 10 cents for their signed block. And I think that they actually made 25 quilt blocks, and then signatures were added from a written list of donors. Much easier than going around and figuring out who was going to buy a block. You signed them up and then you did the quilt writing later. And the income would equate to about $875 today. So they made some money from this. And over the years, I think what's happened is that the histories of each quilt have melded. Was the AVC quilt destined to be an engagement and wedding quilt? Did the messy signatures encourage the use of a scribe for the second quilt? And are the block patterns related or coincidental? Now, it only turned out when I drew the diagram for the Historical Society quilt, it was only then when I realized, oh my goodness, it's the same block, because if you color it in, there it is, right? It's just that our complicated triangular block is just a variation on the theme of the more simple block here. Is that a coincidence, or was that somebody being very smart? I don't know. So one in the Annisquam Village Church, one in the firehouse. They look very different in size and style. Both created at the turn of the century. Is there a connection between them? What do you think? Obviously, similar people were involved in both quilts, or the same people, but they don't completely match, and there are some unusual signatures on that village church quilt that I think are related to the families as opposed to the community.
I can tell you that the 12 pieces that were put together in 1980, whatever.
Yeah.
They were given to the sewing circle.
Here you go, Connie.
Ann Laura was in charge of this.
Do you want to take
Yeah. Ann Laura, Rue, Gail, and I tried to sew these things together.
Now, these, nothing to do with these.
No, it's that there's pieces that were given. We tried to sew. They were not all the same size. It was a horror show. So that's when Mrs. Kimball, who knew a lot about quilts, we took it up to her house. She lived in the house that.
Isn't it where Isabel Brown?
It's where Isabel Brown is now, yes, we took it up there. And she's the one who then located Mrs. Golden.
Wendy Golden.
To put it all together. It was then raffled off at a Christmas fair. And Marge Ross won it. And said, I don't want it. and Tom O'Keefe said, oh yes, you're about to go to Don Ush's granddaughter's wedding, and you're going to take that as a wedding present. And that's what happened.